Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar. This AbleNet webinar is called Why is the Student Having Difficulty with Eye Gaze? My name is Michelle Lange and I'm an occupational therapist in the Denver, Colorado area. I've worked in assistive technology for many years. I work quite a bit with positioning the client and with a variety of areas of assistive technology such as power wheelchairs and speech generating devices. A lot of my job as the OT when it comes to a speech generating device is figuring out, is the client positioned well, is the device positioned well, and how is the client going to access it? So today we're going to be talking about eye gaze access, specifically what to do if our client is somewhat struggling with this technology. If you have specific goals for our session here today, feel free to type them in the chat box. As we go through this webinar here today, you can enter comments or questions you'd like in the chat box whenever you would like. We want this to be really interactive. If I don't answer you right away, it's just because I know that information is coming up soon or I'm just waiting to get to a good stopping point, but I will definitely get to your question. So again, just some specific goals, things you want to make sure that we address in this PowerPoint today, in this webinar, about eye gaze access to speech generating devices. Feel free to type that into the chat box. And I will read those once they show up. So this is what we'll be covering in the next hour. Let's say that you are working with a student who's using eye gaze to control or access a speech generating device, but perhaps it's not going as well as you would like. We're going to cover exactly what eye gaze technology is and how it works. It's important to understand how this works, and it can be different from manufacturer to manufacturer. Each technology is unique, so that we can better problem solve it and optimize use for our clients. We want to talk about what are some of the common barriers that that can get in the way of successful use for our clients, what we can do to optimize use of eye gaze, and how do we determine when we've tried everything and perhaps we need to explore a different access method. All right, one of our goals came in and it's a good one. What about fatigue? And let's definitely make sure to cover that because some of our clients can use eye gaze but have difficulty over a longer period of time. So what is eye gaze? Well, eye gaze is sometimes considered a direct access method. Direct access includes things like reaching out with a finger and touching a selection on a display or on a keyboard. Eye gaze is also considered to be a direct access method because the client looks directly at their target and that's how they select it. So just like reaching out with a finger and touching that selection, our eyes are directly making a selection. Other folks consider this to be more of a hybrid access method because eye movements are translated into movement of a cursor or a highlight, similar to mouse access. So if you're into terminology and categorizing these sort of things, you might see eye gaze categorized as either a direct access method or as a hybrid access method. So how does this work? Well, eye tracking is used to determine where a person is looking at their computer screen, at their speech generating screen. So there has to be some means of tracking, usually through a camera, where the client's eyes are. In some of these technologies, this is referred to as an illuminator. An illuminator sends out infrared light, and that's reflected by our eyes. So you've probably taken pictures of family members or friends, and sometimes someone's eyes turn red. The light is being reflected by the pupils, and it looks red in the photograph. This is very similar. These illuminators send out an infrared light. It's reflected back, and then a camera measures using very sophisticated technology the reflections and then determines where on the screen the client is looking. Now, eye gaze technologies have been around really for quite a bit of time, but they've advanced tremendously. A lot of the clients I worked with in the past who could not use successfully eye gaze can now because the technologies have improved so much. Specifically, the client doesn't have to keep their head as still as was required in the past. These cameras are sophisticated enough to still accurately measure where the eyes are looking. All right, we have another goal here I'll read too. Elena says that her goal is to learn tips for setting up eye gaze positioning, both of the client and the speech generating device, appropriately during that assessment. So definitely talking about that, because if the client's not well positioned or the device isn't well positioned in relationship to them, this isn't going to work. And that doesn't mean the client isn't able to use eye gaze. It means we need to do a little more work. So there's a few options out there for communication. Our main options right now are Tobii Dynavox and Punky Romic's new eye tracking system. Tobii Dynavox has two primary devices that utilize eye gaze. First is the i12 Plus and then the i15 Plus, and the difference is in size of the device itself. They also have some other options to run their eye gaze technology either on a computer or on a tablet. Let me get my little arrow here. And in this picture here, the technology, the illuminators, and the camera that reads the reflection of the eyes is down in this bar below the actual display. So Tobii Dynavox uses a 3D model of the eye, and it allows the client to move their head while using eye tracking. Again, this is really, really critical. It used to be that in the past, the client had to keep their head perfectly still for this technology to work. So much so that part of my job for positioning was to recommend a head support that could lock the client into position, at least during the time they were communicating. So this has changed quite a bit. From there, we have a couple options on Tobii Dynavox. They have something called dark pupil tracking and bright pupil tracking. In dark pupil tracking, the illuminators are placed a little further away from the camera. The camera is in the center of the device, and these illuminators are on either side of it. So they're placed further away, and that creates less reflection on the pupils. Bright pupil tracking, the illuminators are placed closer to the camera. The Tobii is able to shift between dark and bright tracking to best capture that reflection. So depending on the lighting in the room or the environment of the client, this uses two different technologies to improve accuracy during tracking. We're going to watch a video here that shows eye tracking on the Tobii, so that if you're not real familiar with tracking technologies and how it works, this will show you that. If you are familiar with it, hang in there just for this video, and then we'll keep moving forward.
Eye tracking is a technology that is used to see where a person is looking on a computer screen. The technology can also be used to control a computer. Instead of using a traditional keyboard and mouse, you control it by using your eyes. Illuminators in the eye tracker send out near-infrared light that is reflected by your eyes. A camera registers these reflections, and through filtering and advanced calculations, we can determine where on the screen you are looking, and then place the computer cursor consistently and accurately. There are certain things that set Tobii Dynavox eye trackers apart from others. Besides an unprecedented patent portfolio and many technical details, one is the fact that we use a unique and very accurate 3D model of a human eye. With this model, you don't need to keep your head still when using a Tobii eye tracker. In fact, you can move your head freely without any significant loss of precision or accuracy. This is particularly beneficial for individuals with uncontrolled head movement, such as those with cerebral palsy. For accurate eye tracking, the eye tracker needs to find your pupils. This can be done through either bright or dark pupil tracking. Bright pupil tracking works similarly to when you get red eyes using a compact camera with a flash. By placing the flash, or in this case the illuminators, farther away from the lens, you can avoid this. This is dark pupil tracking. Tobii Dynavox eye trackers are unique in that they dynamically switch between bright and dark pupil tracking, so you'll always have an optimized eye tracking experience. There are many other things that make Tobii Dynavox eye trackers unique. To learn more, please visit tobiidynavox.com.
All right, so thank you. I see a few comments. I think a few people might have had a little technical difficulty during the video. Hopefully, if you really couldn't see that video and you're interested in it, if you go to the Tobii Dynavox website, you can see a number of videos that illustrate how eye gaze works. It might have to do with your internet speed. We had another goal that someone listed in our chat box there. Someone says they have a client whose head is nearly always tilted to the side or moving due to muscle tone spasming, so we can address that. And someone else says they're having issues with a client who has convergence insufficiency, difficulty making those eyes work together, and visual aversion, difficulty sustaining eye gaze. So we'll try to touch on those as well. A few people have also mentioned the IMAX system, and I'm not going into detail about every single system in this. I'm touching upon a couple that I work with personally, and I don't have very much experience with the IMAX right now, but hopefully the information we're going to cover in the webinar will also apply to the IMAX. So another common option is the Accent series from Parentzomic. They use the new eye tracking system, and that is this lower bar here. Again, captures the movement of the eye and translates that into where the eye is looking on the display to make a selection. This can be, again, pretty high tech because look at all these selections on this display. There's quite a few. So in order for this camera to determine exactly where someone's looking, it does require quite a bit of precision just in the technology itself. So there are various strategies to determine where the eyes are using a camera that sees the reflected light within the pupils of the eyes. How does the client then make selection? I can get my eyes gazing at a certain location, but I have to tell the device I want to know, I want to make this selection. So activation can be done in 3 different ways on most of these devices: dwell, blink, or switch. So with dwell, the client needs to sustain gaze at their desired selection for a programmed amount of time. It has to be distinguished from time I spend just looking around. So if I'm trying to think of what I want to say, it's very common to visually scan through my selections. And then when I stop on one, I have to stay there for a longer amount of time than when I'm just looking around. If it's a really long time, some clients are going to have quite a bit of difficulty because they're going to perhaps not be able to sustain their gaze for that long, or it simply just takes a long time to communicate. If it's too fast, the client might have accidental activation. So we have to determine, can the client sustain gaze to activate and make a choice? Another option is simply blinking. The trick here from a programming standpoint is this needs to be an intentional blink, longer than our normal eye blinks, because of course we blink our eyes all throughout the day. So this intentional blink acts as a switch activation. This is similar to using an eye blink switch. An eye blink switch measures a more intentional eye blink. In this case, the eye gaze technology itself is able to measure an intentional eye blink. Now, part of the challenge with eye blink for some clients is if the client has landed on a certain location on their speech generating device, and now they want to select it, by creating this intentional longer blink, they might lose their location, at least upon opening. But even as they attempt to make a long blink, it might move the eye away from the desired location. So it's important to determine if the client is able to sustain that blink while they are starting that, sustain that eye gaze on the desired location while they're initiating that long eye blink. And then we have switch. The client can hit a switch anywhere they have control on their body, and that can make the selection. The difficulty is the client has to sustain eye gaze on a location while they're activating the switch. That requires something called dissociation. That means I can coordinate two different movements of my body. It's kind of like patting the top of your head and rubbing your stomach, right? Which personally I can't do at all. So I have to be able to maintain, sustain eye gaze while I move another part of my body. And for a lot of our clients, because they already inherently have some motor control issues, that can cause the eyes to move, because the eyes, especially in conditions like cerebral palsy, often direct movement. So if the client, as in this picture, has a switch by the side of her head, when she turns her head, there's a good chance her eyes are going to move a little bit to that side. So important, again, to make sure the client can activate that switch without losing their contact, visual contact, with their desired selection. So this is Cassidy. She uses eye gaze, but she has difficulty sustaining her visual gaze. She was using dwell, and it was working for her, but she had to wait a long time for each selection to be activated. So her communication was getting quite slow, and her communication partners were often walking away from her. Very, very frustrating. So we tried a switch in various locations to see if she was able to sustain her visual gaze while she hit a switch, and to see if this was faster than dwell. For Cassidy, different for every client, right? But for Cassidy, she was able to activate this switch by the side of her head while sustaining her visual gaze. That increased her communication speed probably by about 50%, which is huge. So for her, it was clearly indicated to use a switch instead of dwell. But these are three options that each have to be teased out. All right, before we move on to common barriers to successful use, we have yet another goal, and this goal is mounting for these devices. And that is a topic that we're going to talk about, the position of the communication device, but probably not have time to go into mounting itself in a lot of detail. We will touch on that, but I would be happy to share some other resources for you on my website, and that's listed on our last slide today. I have a mounting chart that compares and contrasts the various mounts that are available on the market right now, and you're welcome to look at that as well. All right, I think I'm caught up with our questions at the moment. Yes, great. Thank you, Carla. All right, so common barriers to successful use. First is positioning. We have to make sure the client is well positioned. And then we need to make sure the device is positioned in relation to the client to optimize eye gaze use. Then we need to look at vision, because vision obviously is a huge part of using eye gaze. Specifically under vision, we have to make sure the client has sufficient acuity to discriminate between all of their vocabulary selections, that they can track between the selections, that they can sustain gaze to make a selection, that they have the required eye movements, and if there's extraneous movement of the eye, such as nystagmus, this can be very challenging, and glasses can sometimes be a barrier as well. So first, positioning. The client must be well positioned to use their body as well as they can, and that includes using eye gaze optimally. Particularly, we want a good head position. If we want our client to have a well-positioned head, that means we need the optimal position we can achieve of the pelvis and the trunk. A lot of our clients slide into a posterior pelvic tilt. They slouch down and their trunk is flexed up. It's very, very difficult to maintain an upright head when you're in that position with your pelvis and with your trunk. It makes the neck flex as well, and then when the client attempts to lift their head, their neck is hyperextended. None of these aid us in eye gaze, so we really need to ensure that the client is positioned well. If that's not part of your job description, you don't do the wheelchair seating, that's fine. You need to coordinate with the people in your area who do to ensure the client is appropriately positioned. And then we need to position the device relative to the client. So here's an example. This little girl here is showing a significant posterior pelvic tilt and trunk flexion or kyphosis. This is all flexible, but she's got this nice rounded position. So where's her head? Well, it's looking down. And if she was to lift her head up right now, her neck would be hyperextended. Not a good spot. Here, I'm determining with my hands where she needs adequate support to keep her pelvis upright, to keep her trunk upright, and you can see that her head comes right up as a result. It's now aligned. And over here, she's in a little demonstration seat. This happens to be an Aspen seating orthosis that's available here in Colorado. And you can see that with this seat, her pelvis is in a neutral alignment. It's not in this posterior tilt, nice and upright trunk, and boom, there's her head. She's leaning against me a little bit. She still needed a head support, but her head's aligned. So if she had an eye gaze system in front of her, guess what? She's looking right at it. So this position is super, super important. Let's look at another example. This is Jesse. Jesse has a linear seating system. This means it has fairly flat surfaces that are behind him and underneath him, the seat in the back. He has a rather unique head positioning system here called the eye to eye. It's available from Stealth Products, but his neck is hyperextended. Now you can't see all of his neck here, but if you look at the position of his head, you can see that it's tipped rearward. His neck's hyperextended, and that's going to impact his ability to use his technology. Now, I had already seen Jesse. His school team asked that I come out because he was having difficulty using his eye gaze system. When I came out, the team was wondering if he needed a different way of accessing his speech generating device, or if they maybe needed to program it different. But what we really needed to do was adjust his head position. Look at where his gaze is. Because of his hyperextended neck, he's looking up here somewhere at the ceiling. But his device is straight ahead of him. So this isn't working for him. Couple turns of the Allen wrench, and now his head is aligned. Once his head is aligned, his gaze is going where it should be, and he could use his device 80% better right off the bat. He didn't need a new device. He didn't need a new access method. The device didn't need to be reprogrammed. His head support had to be readjusted. So very important to first look at positioning of the client and look at positioning in relation to the device. So once we improved his gaze, yay, we were in business. So look again, difference here between these two positions. So here is Jesse looking up at the ceiling, and here's Jesse better aligned. Now, not only is this alignment helping him with his eye gaze, but you can imagine it's also helping him with his breathing and his swallowing as well, and just visually attending to his environment, not just his eye gaze system. And here's another example. This is Jessica. She is successfully using her eye gaze. Even though it's mounted a little on the low side, you can see that she is using her eye gaze here. However, she's positioned in a lot of posterior pelvic tilt. It's hard to tell in this picture. but my job was to look at her positioning and look at her access. She's in a huge amount of posterior pelvic tilt, and it's causing significant back pain. We asked her, why are you in all this posterior pelvic tilt? Can we reposition you so you're sitting upright? She explained to us that she had to slide down intentionally in her wheelchair to use her eye gaze. If she was sitting upright in her wheelchair, she could not. So her solution was slide into a posterior pelvic tilt. Our solution was raise the mount. So we raised the mount. That allowed her to sit upright with her pelvis, upright trunk, and still readily use her eye gaze. This improved her posture, reduced her back pain, and reduced pressure risk, because we don't want to be sitting on our sacrum. We want to be sitting correctly. And she was still able to communicate. We certainly don't want our clients to be sliding forward simply because otherwise they can't access their device. So this is another example of how very, very important it is that the client is positioned well in relationship to their device. Let's look at a comparison here again. Here's Jessica slumped forward. It's a little hard to tell here. I should have gotten a picture of her in a little different spot from the side, but she's quite in a posterior pelvic tilt here. You could see the level of her device. We raised that device up, and now she's sitting upright. If you look to the left again, look, the top of her head is about even with the top of the head support. Here she's well above it because that's how much taller she is sitting up in this system, and again, still able to use her device. All right, we have a request to go back to another picture. And Amy, I'm hoping this is the picture that you were interested in. If you could just put a yes in the box there so I know that's the right one. Thank you, Amy. So again, this is Jessie, and we're looking at that hyperextended position of the neck versus a more neutral position. These pictures are also in your handout, though smaller, so you can look at them there as well. Or share those photos if you're finding you have a client with these issues. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about device placement. Eye gaze devices are usually mounted higher than when we use another access method, such as direct or switch access, because we're trying to provide that direct line of sight without the head hanging forward, without a hyperextended position. This means we need a mount that is a little tougher. It takes a stronger mount to hold something so high because we now have more of a lever arm, and these devices often weigh more because of the technology required for eye gaze. So that's something we need to keep in mind with mounting, and there is some more information on the mounting chart that's available on my website. If the device is mounted too low, keeping the head tipped forward increases the weight that the neck must hold. It's a biomechanical problem. So if my head is perfectly balanced over my trunk and I'm looking straight ahead, that takes much less effort than if my head is hanging forward while I look at something. Now, we know a lot of this because there's a lot of research right now about people who are walking around looking at their smartphones all day long, right? Every inch forward of a neutral head position can increase the weight of the head on the spine by an additional 10 pounds. So our head weighs about 10 pounds as it is. We are used to balancing that over our trunk. If we keep tipping it forward and tipping it forward, the biomechanical lever arm there changes the weight of the head, so it takes more effort to hold it up. You can see that if someone is really leaning their head forward at about 60 degrees, this in essence is supporting 60 pounds here. Many of our clients can't do that, and so it's important, depending on the client, to really mount that device up high so their head can be perfectly upright, looking straight ahead. There's less effort to do so. So here's our challenge. When the device is in a good position, I can't see my client. So they can see the device, but their vision's blocked for other activities, like seeing what's going on in the front of the classroom, or blocking their visual field if they're driving a power chair. So what can we do? Well, one solution is that we can move the client's mobility base so that they're at a bit of an angle to allow them to see around them a little better. So in this case with Jessica here, her device isn't as high as some people's are placed, but still fairly high if I'm standing right in front of her, or particularly if I'm sitting in front of her. So if we angle her just a little bit, look, I can see all of her cute shirt, and she can see me more readily. So often if I'm working with someone using eye gaze, I will stand at a diagonal to them rather than in front of them, so they have a better visual field of me. Another option is to look at a power mount. So here we can see a picture of a power mount. This one happens to be available from Motion Concepts, where we have the mount in a position where the client has it mounted directly in front of them, but the client can hit a switch and move this down and back up again. Now, we don't have a lot of product options for this right now. The main one that has been available is from a company called Motion Concepts. Motion Concepts is owned by Invacare. There's been some changes with Invacare lately, and it's difficult to get this unless someone has an Invacare chair. Another option, though, that just came out, I just saw this at Resna this weekend, is from Mountain Mover. Mountain Mover now has 2 power options. If you're familiar with Mount and Mover, there are joints on it that they label shoulder, elbow, and it's kind of a tilt, I guess you could call it a wrist. And they have a power option at the shoulder and a power option with the tilt. So imagine if we have a device here, the tilt would flatten the device out so the client could look over it, but the device would remain pretty much in the same position on the mount. Mount looks different than this. So if you're looking for a power mount, really handy when it comes to eye gaze systems, I would encourage you to check out Mountain Mover. They have a nice video on there right now about this very newly released power mount. Funding, very difficult with power mounts. Very important that we add lots of documentation to our reports explaining why the person needs to move this position for various activities. A prime example would be a client who needs the device right in front of their face for eye gaze and needs it moved downward for using a power chair. Let's watch a quick video of this. And this is the Motion Concepts option. You can see it moving forward. There is a version, I'm not sure if it's on this one, that also, yeah, it's not on this version. They've changed this several times. They haven't sold a lot of these, and they keep redesigning it, but it is possible to tilt the angle of the device as well, so the client can flatten it, make it more parallel to the floor for getting it out of their line of sight. Okay. Before we get to vision, let's see. Someone has asked, any suggestions for drooping eyelids, preventing proper pupil capture? There are some clients who have difficulty keeping their eyes open, and this can be for a variety of reasons. I've worked with a few clients who have spinal muscular atrophy, who have difficulty because of profound muscle weakness keeping their eyes open. In those cases, we've sometimes had to look at a different access method because we simply can't capture enough of the pupil. I've had one client who had a surgery. I'm not sure exactly what they did in that surgery, but allowed him to keep his eyes more open. And I've had some clients, I'm a little reticent to do this myself, where someone has literally taped their eyelids, and it requires that someone is consistently putting drops in the eyes to keep them moist, or even a saline gel. But rather than do that all day long, I will usually look at a different access method, usually auditory scanning, so the person can hear their choices if they can't see them. And Amy has asked in the last slide, did you mean angling the client with their device on an angle so that you can see them, or moving the device over to the side? Usually, if I'm concerned that the client cannot see directly in front of them, their field of vision is skewed or obstructed by the device, I will place them at an angle to what is in front of them. So if you have a student sitting in the classroom, I would place their chair at an angle to the front of the classroom so they can look directly at their device and look to the side towards the front of the classroom so that they have the best of both fields of view. Victoria's asked about the approximate price of the power mount for motion concepts. You know, I'm really not sure what they charge for that right now. They have continued to change it each time we've ordered one, and we've only ordered a few over the years. And so since they modify it, the price changes a bit each time, but expensive, several $1,000s, I'm sure. And the new mount mover one, I think, is in the $3,000 range. It's very expensive. Elena has asked, what are the general guidelines for an appropriate distance between the client and an I-15? Tobii. Oh, thank you, Carla. Carla Googled the mountain mover. It's 3,200. And it's going to depend, too, if you have movement at the shoulder and that tilt movement, or just one of those. But very new. In terms of distance between the client and the device, there's not a set distance. It's kind of a combination of it. What distance can the client accurately see all of their choices and discriminate between them? And at what distance is the camera most accurately capturing their movement? So you could check with Tobii Dynavox to see if they have a recommended starting distance, but mine varies a bit. And it really does depend on those things, is where the client can best see the device and where their movements are captured. And not just captured, but where they can reach all areas of the display using their eyes. So, of course, if that camera was really, really close, it wouldn't allow the client to look at all of the device accurately. It wouldn't capture that. It would only capture perhaps the middle of the device. And Amy has said that the recommended range, she thinks, is between 18 and 24 inches. So I find it's something I need to look at with each individual client. Sometimes I need to move it a little further away, too, because I have a client who's trying to reach it with their hands but doesn't have enough motor control for direct access. But I don't want them to collide with it and accidentally activate things. All right, so let's talk about vision, because we're still talking about barriers to using eye gaze, and vision is really important, obviously. So first we have acuity. Acuity is important to allow the client to see each of these icons and discriminate between them. So depending on the device, there can be quite a bit that someone's looking at. And some of these icons might look kind of similar to each other. So the client has to have adequate acuity. If they don't, well, we can make the selections larger, and the screen can change depending on the device. We can move between displays. But if we don't have a lot of information on each screen, and the client has a large vocabulary requirement, this can become a problem because the client has to scroll through or move through so many different pages. So we have to determine, does the client have enough acuity to functionally use this device? And then, of course, can the client visually track across those icons on the display? Tracking is something that most of us do really easily, like when we're reading a book. But for clients who have visual issues, tracking can be difficult. Sometimes it's not very smooth, and the client may have difficulty using eye gaze as a result. And then finally, the client has to sustain their gaze. So first they need to have enough acuity to see the desired selection. They need to be able to move their eyes or track smoothly, possibly, over to that selection, and then sustain that gaze. If they can sustain their gaze, we can use dwell. If the client can't sustain their gaze as well, we could also try activating a switch, but they do need to sustain the gaze until that switch activation is complete. They may not have to dwell as long if they use a switch, but it is important to look again, can they sustain their gaze while they're activating a switch or while they're blinking? What about glasses? Well, most eye gaze systems work pretty well with glasses. However, if you have a client who has a very strong prescription, there tends to be quite a bit of distortion in the lens, except for the very center. So if any of you perhaps have a very strong prescription and you wear glasses some of the time or all the time, you know that you can't move your eyes around a lot, you move your head, and that keeps your eyes in the center of that lens. If the client is using a strong prescription, that distortion can sometimes cause some problems with the recognition from the cameras because of the distortion created. It messes with the reflection. But if the client is moving their eyes around, the eyes may only really accurately be measured when they're in the center of the glasses. So the client either has to move their entire head around, which they might be doing anyway, but even then I have had difficulty with clients with a very strong prescription using this well. There are some nice advances in this technology with glasses, and there are some very thin lens options that are available now, even for strong prescriptions. So this is an option you can give to a family. Challenge is you can't guarantee that it's still going to work with eye gaze, but you can recommend that they talk to their optometrist about filling their glasses with a much thinner lens. It will cost more than the thicker ones. Another option is, can the client switch to a contact lens? I work with a lot of clients who have cortical visual impairment, or CVI, and this can really be a challenge when it comes to eye gaze. People who have CVI do not have a problem with the eye itself. Acuity is not the problem. It's what the brain does with the information it receives from the eyes. CVI is notorious for changing over the course of a day and over the course of a lifetime. So some young children with CVI may see quite a bit of improvement, especially if they're receiving visual therapy over the years as they get older. But it's hard to anticipate. I've certainly worked with clients who did not see very much improvement as they got older despite intervention. Other clients make fantastic progress. People who have CVI often need to hold their head at very unique positions to optimize their vision, and these head positions vary depending on how their brain is interpreting the information at that point in time. Again, there's not a consistency here with CVI with many clients. So it's important to allow these clients to assume these odd head positions, what may look odd to us, in order to optimize their vision. Challenge with that, though, is when the device is calibrated, it's calibrated for a certain position of the eyes and the head. And if the client moves their head dramatically away from that position, this position may not be as recognizable by the technology. So it's something we have to try and see if it works with this client. Another challenge for people who have CVI is sustained gaze. Sustained gaze is a real challenge for people with CVI. So we either need to program a pretty short activation time if we're doing dwell, or pursue some other options. Again, I work with a lot of people who have CVI. Some of them are able to use eye gaze. Many of them just can't quite do it right now, and we need to look at other options. Nystagmus. Some of our clients have extraneous movement of the eyes. Nystagmus is where we see kind of a bouncing movement of the eyes, where they might rhythmically move to one side or even up and down, but usually side to side. That means the pupil is moving, and nystagmus can really create havoc with eye gaze technologies. So if someone has nystagmus, you can certainly give it a try. Absolutely try this before you recommend eye gaze. But many people with nystagmus are not going to be able to use eye gaze with the current level of technology. This is Haley, and Haley was trying out eye gaze. One of the challenges we had is this was her usual head position, so we definitely made some changes to her seating and her head support to try to encourage a more upright position. She has quite a strong prescription in her glasses, and it led to a lot of distortion in the lens except for the very center of the lens, and that made calibrating the eye gaze unsuccessful. Because of her cortical visual impairment, she also had a really difficult time sustaining her gaze. So even if she could get her gaze to her desired location, she couldn't sustain it long enough to dwell or to activate a switch or to blink. Again, she had a hard time keeping her head up and her eyes towards the display, and even though we made some changes in her positioning, she just didn't quite have all the components required to successfully use eye gaze. And as a result, she's using auditory scanning now. The auditory portion is to compensate for her visual issues. All right. Hold on those questions, and I'm going to answer those in just a minute. So what can we do in general to optimize someone's eye gaze use? Well, we can optimize the client's position, particularly the position of the head. But remember, the head is very, very dependent on the position of the pelvis and the trunk. If this is an area you don't work in, no problem. Refer back to the team that recommended that wheelchair seating system, or find a qualified seating and mobility team in your area and refer to them. Let them know that you're exploring eye gaze and that the position of the head is very, very important. We need to optimize the device position, and that's in relation to the client to optimize their accuracy using eye gaze. We need to do whatever we can to optimize vision for this client. That might be getting thinner lenses for their glasses or even exploring contacts. It could be allowing someone to assume a head position that might look a little wonky to you and I, but allows for their best vision. Depending on the device, there's quite a bit we can do with calibration and programming, other programming, to optimize someone's ability to use this particular device. But there are times where we've tried everything and it's just not working. So despite our best efforts, some clients just simply are not going to be able to use eye gaze, just like there's clients that can't use other access methods. So if the client cannot access the device despite every effort we make, then we need to explore a different way of accessing the device. If the client can access the device, but they're pretty inefficient, it takes too much time, it takes too much effort, their accuracy isn't very good, then we want to look at a different access method as well. This can be tricky because there's going to be a team member that says, "Are you kidding me? Look, they're choosing things." But just because they're choosing things doesn't mean it's what they want to choose. We want to choose whatever access method is most efficient. If there's a lack of consensus on the team, I try to pull the team back to our common shared goal. Our common shared goal is communication. It's not eye gaze. So as much as someone might be really excited about eye gaze because, hey, it's cool, our main goal is communication. And there's a variety of access methods. If eye gaze is holding a client back in their communication, we definitely want to explore something else. And that includes if their vocabulary is limited because of how well or not so well they use eye gaze. Usually someone who can't use eye gaze is going to need to use switch access with auditory scanning. All right, we have a number of questions here, and I know there's other questions that people are waiting to type. So I want to touch on some of those goals we had from the beginning. So Martine has asked, is there a significant difference in efficiency between standalone eye gaze cameras and integrated systems? And she mentions they only have access to the Tobii PC Eye Mini at our program. I am not an expert enough to answer that particular question. These technologies vary. There's definitely differences in exactly how they work. If you have a client where you think perhaps changing one for another might help them, I would arrange a trial, definitely, before you recommend something. However, what I would say is that in general, if a client cannot use one eye gaze technology, they're probably going to have difficulty with another one as well. The differences between them, even though there definitely are differences, there's differences in how they're calibrated, differences in how they're programming. If someone really can't use one eye gaze technology, it's a lot less likely they'll be able to use another one. Elena has asked, how do you know whether nystagmus is to blame for eye gaze challenges over other potential barriers? Well, if you find that you've positioned the client well, that they should have adequate vision to allow you to calibrate the system, but you're having difficulty either achieving successful calibration or with use of the device, chances are it's the nystagmus. That extra movement is really difficult. All right, I want to touch on a few of those goals we had at the beginning because they're really excellent points. First is fatigue. You know, when voice recognition first came on the market, we thought someone just had to have sufficient, what would be the terminology there? Sufficient articulation in their voice to be recognized by that technology. What we didn't count on is that people would soon develop repetitive stress injuries. So people were talking so much to their computers that they were developing a unique injury to their vocal cords. They needed training to allow them to use that device with the least amount of repetitive stress injury risk. With eye gaze, it's easy for someone to spend a large amount of time looking over and over and over at their device. And we can have some subsequent problems, one of which is fatigue, second of which is dry eyes. People who use eye gaze a lot may need to use some drops to help them with that. And like all of us, instead of staring at our computer all day, we need to give ourselves a visual break. So a client using eye gaze needs to take breaks where they look at something else for a while, they close their eyes for a while, just get away from it because we can have that fatigue and eye strain. We had another person who had mentioned that they had a client whose head was moving around a lot or always tilted to the side. It's important to, first of all, examine why does this client always have their head tilted to the side? Is it because they're optimizing their vision? Is it torticollis? Is it a muscle tone that's pulling the head in that position? I would again work with the positioning team to see if there's a way they can optimize this client's head position. I just saw a very young boy a couple weeks ago whose head is tilted quite a bit to the side. It's lots of muscle tone. We were able to reposition his head using a different style head support, and his head is in a much better position, and that allows him more variety in his access options. If the client's tilting their head because that's where they need to be visually, then you have to see, is there a way I can calibrate the system to accommodate for that head tilt? Someone else mentioned they have a client who has convergence insufficiency, and I believe by that you mean that those eyes are not always moving together. And that can be a challenge, and when you're calibrating that person's eyes, the system may or may not be able to compensate for that, especially if it's not a consistent relationship of the eye position to each other. So it's something you really have to try and see if you can compensate for. If you cannot, then might have to look at a different method. And if you're working with a client who has visual aversion, and by that I'm guessing difficulty with a sustained gaze, obviously sustained gaze is very necessary. Amy has mentioned a great point, with convergence insufficiency, would tracking one eye be a benefit? Definitely great option, thank you, where you can use just one eye. Often a client with that tendency is going to have one eye that tends to be a little more dominant, a little more functional, and you could just track that one eye and see if that's enough for this person to have good efficiency, good success. Oh boy, sorry. Sorry, question of how about children who have Rett syndrome who are still walking? How do you address mounting? Well, if you could please let me know if that client is using eye gaze, that would help me answer that question. That would be great. Someone else has also asked about children with Rett syndrome. Can you comment on the use with this type of technology with children with Rett syndrome? I guess you're having more referrals in that area. Rett syndrome is such a difficult, challenging population. People with Rett syndrome certainly look like they have often adequate motor skills to use direct access. However, really don't have intentional functional use of their hands. By the time someone loses a degree of motor control with Rett syndrome and would perhaps need to be looking at eye gaze, the challenge is that there's cognitive decline as well. So the question would be if the client can understand this task, and whether using eye gaze makes more sense from a cognitive standpoint for this client than using a switch. I would recommend in general that you really just going to have to try out both. That's what I would do to see what the client is most responsive to. Another question here. We have lots and lots of questions here. We have a clarification on the question of the ambulatory child with Rett syndrome. Yes, they're using eye gaze. Well, you know, to be honest, I have never used eye gaze with someone who is ambulatory. So I am guessing that for good access, this person is going to need to walk from one location to another and then be seated to accurately use their device. That means we need that device to follow them. There's been a lot of attempts to use a mount that can move around with a person. Part of the challenge is that some of our mobile clients are using some form of walker or gait trainer. If you try to mount something to it, it just is heavy, it can make things tippy, it can be a challenge. I usually, even though I'm a huge fan of independence, will recommend that a caregiver that this child would undoubtedly have carry this rather expensive and breakable device from location to location and then place it securely somewhere where the client can then be seated again and use it for communication. There are lots of things people have used who have tried, but I really worry about things tipping over and leading to damage to the device. And then and that was your solution. Great. Well, I agree with your solution then. Thank you very much. Okay, and then let's get one more question here, and then we're going to wrap this up because we're almost at our hour, and I want to make sure that we respect everyone's time, and I get to these last few slides as well. Our last question is there a particular recommendation whether we can tilt the screen on the side to accommodate a client's position or not? If the client has an unusual head position, I would first try to keep that screen upright and see if you can calibrate to their head position either with one or two eyes. If you can't, it's going to depend on the device, and I would really recommend in that particular situation talking to the company, the manufacturer themselves, and let them know your issue. They might have a representative in your area or be able to give you some further guidance on the phone because it's a tricky scenario there. All right, If you have more questions, feel free to type them in. I'm going to wrap this up, but if we're able to stay online a little longer, I can try to answer a few more questions. But I am going to quickly wrap this up for those who have to leave. We have a couple upcoming webinars. In August, we're going to talk about how to determine where a student can access a switch. So if they need to use switch access, how do we figure out where to put it? And then in September, how to determine which type of switch the client can use. And here is my contact information, including my website. And again, there is a mounting chart on there that compares various mounts. The only mount that's not on there quite yet is this power mount from Mountain Mover, as it's brand new. We have a question. Yes, this webinar will be available as a recorded webinar, so you're welcome to pick that up later on or have other people watch it. Great. And we want to thank you on behalf of AbleNet for attending the webinar here today. And there's other webinars that I've done this year for AbleNet. You can also look those up in the library as well. All right, if you need to hop off this webinar now, that is fine. If you have more questions, feel free to type those in, and if we can stick around for another couple minutes, I'll be happy to try to pick those up. All right, we have a question. Can you comment on the success of using eye gaze for a student that uses peripheral vision? Lots of kids with CVI use peripheral vision. They sneak glances to the side. The challenge with people who use peripheral vision is sustained gaze is usually difficult for them. So I would caution you that if a client's using peripheral vision, they may have difficulty sustaining that vision. But as long as you can calibrate the device, you might have to position the device so it's more skewed to the side rather than midline, but you can certainly give it a try and see if it works. All right, well, I'm not seeing any more questions here. If you're typing, keep typing. So I think we'll go ahead and close out this webinar. Again, thank you very much for attending. Look for the recorded version if you need it, and I hope to see you at an upcoming AbleNet webinar.